Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are jumping into some oak barrel aged dark flavored beers. Different styles, different brewers, but they both have that commonality between the oak and they are flavored and of course both dark beers. Starting with the brewer that I've never had a beer from prior, so it's always exciting for me. This is Abnormal Beer Company's Sugar Spice Nice. This is a strong ale that clocks in at 12% ABV. It's also been brewed with star anise, cinnamon, clove, and allspice, oak barrel aged. They are based in San Diego, California. For number two, we're jumping over to our old friends, 903 Brewers Double Chocolate Cherry Stout. This is an imperial milk stout, clocking in 1% higher at 13% ABV. And it has been oak barrel aged as well. So two vastly different directions on big high ABV dark beers, both flavored and oak barrel aged. Now when I say dark, strong ales can be really any color of the rainbow. Typically they're going to be kind of a nut brown ale color to kind of a caramel color. But they can be really any color of the rainbow. So I'm making an assumption here. I could be wrong, but that's part of the fun. We're going to find out. So we're going to jump right in, starting with Abnormal Beer Company's Sugar Spice Nice, the strong ale that clocks in at 12% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's oak barrel aged dark flavored beer review, we got Abnormal Beer Company. This is called Sugar Spice Nice. It is a strong ale that clocks in at 12% ABV. It's been brewed with star anise, cinnamon, clove, and allspice, oak barrel aged, and they are based in San Diego. This also is a blended strong ale, which I'll get to in a minute. But let's start with the label art. In terms of label art, you can see it's just a very neat, very clean looking design. Nothing fancy or over the top, but it does look fantastic. It is also a wax dipped bottle, so luckily I've got my pointy end of my bottle opener here, so I will just score right under the cap edge all the way around, and that will free the wax out of the way so that with any luck on first try, I can get a good grip with this bottle opener and get this right off. And indeed I did. All right, perfect. So let's get this poured right in the glass and see if it is a dark one or if it's a lighter strong ale. Yep, it's that kind of right in the middle, that caramelly, almost barley wine looking or wheat wine color, which, like I said, they can run the gamut. They can be a little darker. It's rare that they're lighter, but they can be even a deep dark brown, bordering on a brown ale or a porter shade I have had. But yeah, it looks absolutely fantastic. Quite effervescent, and it's got a very pungent aroma. I could smell it as I was pouring it, though I was trying my best to not breathe in too deeply because I kind of want to just see what it is when I get my nose over it. But yeah, very dark caramel color, which is right smack in the middle of the typical color range for a strong ale. It formed an okay head, very effervescent, so, you know, I probably should have poured very vigorously into this. I did not, but it did okay. But honestly, with all this carbonation coming up, it would have collapsed quite quickly. Strong ales, a lot of grains, a lot of alcohol, sugars to be eaten, so they tend to be a lot more carbonated. It just kind of goes with the territory. They're not always, but that is typical. In terms of aroma, let's get right up on it. Oh yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you how good that smells. And I'll tell you exactly what it reminds me of. It reminds me of my mom's homemade apple cider that she makes every winter, and it smells absolutely delicious. I kind of wasn't sure what to expect with that blend of additives, star anise, cinnamon, clove, and allspice, but yeah, it really does remind me a ton of homemade apple cider, and it smells absolutely delicious. Yeah, there's a little bit of that caramelly undertone that I'm getting from the malts, but by and large, these spices are really what's sticking out. And it has a slight sweet nose to it as well. So before I jump in, I also mentioned this is a blended strong ale. If you've ever seen that term on a beer, blended, and you're not really sure what it means, it you're probably on the right track if you're just thinking, well, it's got to be a blend of different beers. You're right. So in this case, it's going to be a blend of different strong ales, different batches. So they could have one batch of this, another batch of it, and they're blending the two batches. Most often it'll be a blend of like 1 year's and another year's, and they'll blend them together to make a new one. Or sometimes they'll take like a standard beer of that type, and maybe they have a barrel-aged version of that type, and they will blend those. But it's exactly what it sounds like, just like blending scotch. If you're into scotch, same thing. It's a blend of multiple different to make this singular beer. So, without further ado, let's jump in and see what this actually tastes like. Oh, oh, that's really, really good. Oh, that's really, really good. Wow. Okay. So, when I said it smelled like my mom's homemade apple cider, it actually, there's a lot of flavors in here that put me in mind of that, though it's not sweet like an apple cider would be, and it doesn't taste of apples. But those flavors, the spices, taste the same. It's just on top of a strong ale. Now, this is not a sweet beer. There's actually a nice bit of bitters on the back, which I really appreciate. But these spices are very, very intense. And it's got this little bit of a boozy bite up front. It doesn't linger around too long, but there is a little bit of a booziness up front. In terms of how these spices actually impact the beer, the spices are very heavy up front. And because of that slight booziness, there is the sensation and suggestion of a sweetness, but immediately you start to realize, yeah, this is not a sweet beer. There's no lactose in sight at all. This is not a sweet beer. It's a nice, well-spiced, very well-made strong ale, and it tastes absolutely delicious. I'm going to jump back in here for another sip for body and mouthfeel and finish, but what I got on first sip, absolutely delicious. I mean, absolutely delicious. This is a medium heavy to heavy body. It's kind of on the border between the two. Maybe not quite as heavy as I anticipated for 12%, but don't don't make the mistake thinking it's not a heavier beer. It is definitely a heavier beer. There's a ton of resistance to the mouthfeel of this as well. It is not exactly viscous, but it is so resistant that it gives the impression of being bordering on kind of a thick, syrupy-like quality to it. It's very nice, and that really helps these flavors coat all around the palate. The finish on this one, again, it's not quite as long as I anticipated, but it's not short at all. It's really not missing the mark by much. And on this one, it's the spices that are pushing it out. The strong ale itself, the actual beer base, it goes out a decent distance, but it dies out much quicker than these lingering spices. This is a heavily, heavily spiced beer. And I gotta be honest, I've never had a spiced strong ale, and it absolutely works in this beer style, 100% does. And the spices that they chose, I'm a big, big fan. Altogether, it just pairs well. It makes a really well-balanced beer drinking experience that's quite unique. I have never seen another spiced strong ale, not to say there aren't any, but this one, really, really nice. This is a real treat. I'm gonna take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get the second beer of today's review. That is 903 Brewers Double Chocolate Cherry Stout and Imperial Milk Stout that clocks in at 13% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's review, we have got 903 Brewers Double Chocolate Cherry Stout. This is an Imperial Milk Stout that has been oak aged. Clocks in at 13% ABV. They're based in Sherman, Texas. Obviously, double chocolate cherry, brewed with chocolate and cherries. So, 903 Brewers always has very interesting can art. On this one, it looks almost like a chocolate gingerbread man or something, and he's got some cherries in his hand. And the color scheme on the can really gets you in the mood. So I have not ever had chocolate cherry beer, and I have a sneaky suspicion in milk stout form, it's going to pair quite well. So let's get this cracked. 13%, this is a big one too. Poured right in the glass. Okay, it's not glugging out as thick as I anticipated, but it is indeed very, very dark. Looks to be quite effervescent. So it's probably going to form an okay head to start here, but I don't know how well it's going to hold, which is okay. Yeah, very, very effervescent, and it's just rushing up. That head that did form, the bubbles rushing up are definitely making it collapse. But that aside, visually, it is not quite pitch black. It is just a shade shy. I can see a little bit of light just through the thinner part of the glass at the bottom, but it's close enough to call it pitch black. Looks great. The head obviously did what it did. Let's see how this actually smells. Okay, this smells very strongly of both chocolate and cherry, and it does indeed smell quite sweet, as it should because it is a milk stout. Aside from the chocolate and the cherry, I can still get a really good sense of the roast level of the malts in here. So it's got a very roasty, nice classic stout backbone. It's just got the chocolate and the cherries added and then lactose to sweeten it, hence the milk stout. So without further ado, let's jump in and see how this one tastes. Oh man. Wow. That's far more rich and intense than I had anticipated. Okay, while this may be a milk stout, this is not one of those puckeringly sweet milk stouts. As I stated, it smells quite sweet. Smells strongly of chocolate, smells strongly of cherry, and indeed I could smell that malt backbone. I gotta tell you, that malt backbone is not lost in this beer by the fact that they sweetened it with lactose. This is a very well-balanced milk stout. Some milk stouts, they really have to be quite sweet. Some I have and I'm like, wow, that's just overly sweet for what they did with it. It would have been nice to get a little sense of, the malt bill underneath, and that comes in full force in this beer. So, up front, literally the first thing you get is you swish, you get chocolate and cherry. That's to be expected. But as soon as you swallow, the chocolate and the cherry take a backseat to just this rush of this beautiful roasty malt backbone. Very deep roast to it, though it's not on the lines of like I compare a lot of deep roasts in stouts and other beer styles to being on the edge of burned, kind of like a French or Italian roast coffee bean. It's not quite like that. There's not a suggestion of smokiness or really even earthiness to this beer. Just a nice deep roast to the malts. And it gives this really great fundamental upon which to build that chocolate and that cherry. So the chocolate really binds quite well to this malt bill. And then the cherries are this nice fruity kind of side that adds in the mix. And that's where the lactose comes into play because that sweetness really accentuates the cherry. But it's not so sweet that you can't taste the dark chocolate and you can't taste the malt bill. So this, to me, is an exercise in a very well-crafted, very well-balanced imperial milk stout. That's how to do it right there. I can get everything that went into making the beer, including the base ingredients, but everything still has its own voice and comes through with absolute clarity. This is a tasty one indeed. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, think of the flavor development and the finish. The body on this one is medium heavy. Not quite as big of a body as I would have anticipated. The mouthfeel isn't viscous, but there is a ton of resistance. So it's not syrupy in terms of viscosity, but there is definitely a boatload of resistance when you move it around the palate. It does feel thick. So that really feels perfectly in line with a 13% ABV to me. In terms of the flavor development, on second sip, everything is just intensified from the first sip. And I'm not really getting anything in a different order or seeing anything peak out or overwhelm anything else. But what I am noticing on the end of this, the finish is longer than average, but it's not obscenely long. Another thing I got on second sip I really didn't pick up on the first sip was the oak aging. That definitely does come through. You cannot really get it on the aroma, but you do get it particularly on the back end of the finish. There is that little bit of woodiness, that distinct oak character that does come through. And at the end of the finish, you're kind of left with that residual bits of the roast of the malt bill and still a good bit of chocolate and cherry. And it just kind of dissipates relatively quickly for the style and the ABV. It's a very pungent beer. It's got a longer than average finish, but it's not as long as some. If this were spirit barrel aged versus just standard oak barrel, probably would extend the length of the finish even greater. But as it stands, it is above average. Overall, a very well put together beer, very tasty indeed. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with Abnormal Beer Company's Sugar Spice Nice. This was an oak-aged strong ale that also had star anise, cinnamon, clove, and allspice in it. 12% ABV on this one. They are based in San Diego, California. So starting with the aroma on this beer smelled absolutely fantastic. As I said, it did remind me of my mom's homemade apple cider. That is the highest compliment I could give it. And it was very pungent. I mean, it just smelled delicious before you even jumped into the beer. Gets a 10 out of 10 for aroma. For the taste on this beer was fantastic. I was kind of surprised because the spice additives were so pungent. I thought that maybe they would overpower the beer, but they didn't. You could still taste this classic strong ale back to it, and there was even a good bit of bitters, which I did not anticipate, and just wonderful, wonderful palette of flavors. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the body, strong ales are high ABV beers, and they do tend to have quite large bodies and relatively viscous mouthfeels. This one was above average, but it wasn't top tier. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, on the other hand, there was an absolute boatload of resistance, exactly what I expected for a strong ale in this ABV range. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish, strong ales can kind of run the range of short, medium, long. This was one of those that was above average, but it wasn't crazy long. Really what helped push it out was the pungency of the added spices. It does get an 8 out of 10. For the head and retention, this was really just low end of average. It was okay, not great, not bad. It gets a 4 out of 10. For the appearance, strong ales, this is another category where they're all a little bit different. They can be very, very light. They can be very, very dark. This one sat right kind of in the middle of what I expect to see for a strong ale. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was absolutely fantastic. I could pick out each individual spice that they added to the beer, as well as the base beer style and the subtleties of that oak aging. It was just balanced masterfully. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling the intangible? I absolutely loved it. I'm a big fan of strong ales. There's not a ton of them out there in the market. And anytime I can get my hands on one, it's always a treat. This was great. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Overall, this beer did do quite well. There were a few categories that I was missing, a few key things, but overall, it did very, very well. This is well above average. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Abnormal Beer Company's Sugar Spice Nice to an 89 out of 100. Moving on to beer number 2, this was 903 Brewers Double Chocolate Cherry Stout, Imperial Milk Stout, 13% ABV, also oak aged. 903 Brewers is based in Sherman, Texas. So the aroma, as you might expect on a big Imperial Stout that's got added ingredients, the aroma was absolutely pungent. I could smell the cherry, I could smell the chocolate, I could smell the base beer and that lactose that added that sweetness to it. Aroma, 10 out of 10. For the taste, this is another one that just did it for me. It was a really good combination of flavors. And for me, on the taste, the thing that really sealed the deal was, yes, there was enough lactose in there that, yes, indeed, it was a milk stout. And it was really there to kind of punch out the cherry, let the fruit speak as a fruit should. But it still let the roasty, rich edge to that malt bill come through, which really ended up binding to the chocolate. So yeah, they got just the right amount of sweetness without making it overbearingly sweet. That's how to do it. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the body, not quite as large as I expected on a 13% Imperial, but it was above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this one, absolutely boatloads of resistance. It was thick, it was creamy. It's what you want in this beer style. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish. Finish on this one was above average, though I did rather expect, based on pungency of flavors, that the finish would extend quite a bit longer than it did. But, you know, it was still above average, but not top tier. It gets a 7 out of 10. Head and retention. This one really did not do a particularly great job. As much as I tried to vigorously pour down, it just barely created a head, and it was gone almost as soon as I poured it. Here it only gets a 1 out of 10. For the appearance, it was not absolutely pitch black, but it was close. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance, I talked about this in terms of flavor. The balance was fantastic. The lactose in particular was a real key for balancing this beer to not make it overtly sweet. The malt bill I could taste, it was delicious. The cherries I could taste, identified them clearly as cherries with that slight sweetness. And the chocolate and really the lactose and the cherries bound together, as did the malt bill and the chocolate. It was just beautiful. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, subjectively, I really enjoyed this stout. I wish there were more imperial milk stouts in the marketplace where they didn't use such a heavy hand with lactose. I truly do believe it pays dividends. Subjectively above average for me, it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, overall, this beer did very well. Above average or well above average in most categories. There were just a few where it wasn't quite as high as I expected. But again, overall, I thought this was a well above average and well put together beer. It gets an 8 out of 10, which brings 903 Brewers Double Chocolate Cherry Stout to an 81 out of 100. So, yet again, two beers that are indeed well above average, completely different, though they shared that oak age commonality. We have an 89 and an 81, 8 points apart, and different beers for distinctly different beer drinkers and tastes, but both worth your time if you're into either style. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the channel. And if you want to stay in the loop and not miss anything when we put them live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.